we look at upper cross syndrome, it can drastically affect scapular movement and thoracic extension and rotation. So if we're sitting like this, they already have the rounded hunch over, like Lee talked about. They can't get in there. It's more than just our lats and all that stuff. It's because of posture, and they just don't know how to turn the muscles back on. Okay? You see the flexion all the time. If I'm in that position now, instead of this position at rest, it's really hard to get to that extension, which is very, very important for anything that we're doing, squatting, throwing, lifting. And then if you're in this flex position here and rounded position, it really affects thoracic rotation, which we know that's extremely important, throwing-wise and hitting-wise. Okay? Here's a study I found in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. It examined the shoulder, scapular, and thoracic spine contribution and max external rotation of shoulder during throwing. This is what the part did. Okay? The results indicated that both the scapula and the thoracic spine play a pivotal role in maximum external rotation of the shoulder. Okay? During the leg cocking phase, or the throwing of the shoulder, is positioned in its max external rotation. So we're talking about, that's usually about the time the shoulders square up to each other, or pretty close. All right? This phase is critical to allow the player to harness max potential energy of the shoulder internal rotators, your subscapularis, your pec major, your latimus dorsi. Okay? Inadequate thoracic spine extension, okay, leads to compensation from the shoulder and places excessive demand on the medial elbow aspect of the elbow. So if I can't get to thoracic extension because my muscles don't know how to turn on, because I'm in this hunch position, it also affects my scapular posterior tilt, because the only way I can get scapular posterior tilt is with thoracic extension. So let's say I lose a couple of degrees of this here. This throw right here total had 144 degrees of external rotation. Well, 138 of it came from the glenohumeral external rotation, the T-spine, and the scapular posterior. 6 of it came from the elbow. Well, guess what happens if I start taking away these degrees just because they can't turn it on? That number is going to go up, because they're still going to try to get that same external rotation, and now we're going to have UCL issues because the elbow is not made to have that much more degree of freedom. Okay? So I personally believe maybe one of the reasons we're having that epidemic in elbow issues now is maybe just because we can't turn the posterior chain of the upper body on correctly in our athletes now. They're not doing it correctly, and now that's putting too much stress on the elbow, because they still know the goal is to throw that 100 miles an hour, or as hard as they can, and so they have to get that external rotation to do it, but they can't get it from here anymore. And so the extra part's going to the elbow. It's just a theory right now. Can't prove it, but I think that, because the problem is we don't have the data of what healthy pitchers were back 25 years ago. They weren't keeping what they got for, we couldn't measure the external rotation of and the extension and all that stuff. We didn't have that technology at that time. Okay? Now, lower cross syndrome. That was upper cross syndrome. Now, lower cross syndrome makes it difficult to initiate a hip hinge. This is a pretty good hip hinge. Fairly vertical shin angle. The knees stay behind the toes. The hips sit back. Okay, we see this. Pretty good hip hinge. But if I have lower cross syndrome, this often leads to knee flexion instead of hip hinge. I would guess 95% of all our athletes we see, this is their biggest issue in the lower half. Their first movement is knee flexion, not hip hinge. Every single time. And once I do that, the lower half is messed up the rest of the throw. And the extra rotation that's going to have to come from is somewhere above the waistline, and we're putting extra stress on the soft tissue somewhere. So you can see where the energy goes, because his knees got out to his toe and they went straight down instead of sit back. Right? So here's a little slide to create maximum internal rotation of the femur. The hip must be flexed at 90 degrees. Okay? So just a little graph here. So this is for the gluteus maximus muscle. Okay, so the glute max, we're going to talk about the glute minimus, medius here in a second also. Okay, look at this. No mid or posterior fibers of that ever contribute to internal rotation, but I do have some anterior fibers of the gluteus maximus that will. Once I get to hip rotation at about, this is straight up and down, 0 hip flexion. I know it's hard to see the bone. And then that's that 90-degree flexion. Everybody see that? Okay? So once I get to about probably 40 degrees of flexion, of hip flexion, now I'll have some glute muscles that'll help with internal rotation. But until you get there, you can't. And then when you get at 90, it'll help you get to about 40% or 40 degrees of internal rotation. Okay? Now let's look at the glute medius muscle, which is a much more internal rotator than the maximus muscle. It's basically that one, that triangle shape that sits right here on the side through your dimple area. Okay? So at 0 degrees of hip flexion, so if we're straight up and down, you can get about 5 to maybe 10 degrees, just depend on structure of internal rotation. So if I'm sitting right here, my leg will turn in 5 to 10 degrees. Just break. Okay? But until I get to about 80 degrees flexion right here, so hip hinge, that means no knee flexion forward. That means completely this hinge going back. Till I get to about 80 to 90, I can't get rotation in. And once I get to that rotation, now I'm going to get about 50 degrees of internal rotation from my leg. Okay? So if I can't get to that hip flexion position, as you can see, it goes less and less and less. So if your first movement is knee flexion and you go down, I'm not getting to, you may only be getting to 40%, 50% hip flexion, which is going to cause you to come out of your rotation earlier, which is what we're going to show you later. And then that's going to make your force be going basically at a 45-degree angle that way from your lower half, and your upper half has to fight to get the ball back on here, which is adding extra stress to the soft tissue, usually the elbow.